Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 16th of November 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, of course, is Mike Robinson. And we're delighted to say we're going to be joined both by Alex Thompson from Eastern Approaches and also by David Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiatives. Well, a brief comment on the weather. Most people are saying that it's quite bright, bit of blue sky and sunshine. It's warm in most places, bit of rain in North Wales. But we're not really interested in the weather today because we can see the European Union beast fully emerging now. And I think our viewers and listeners are going to find this one of the most extraordinary news programmes that UK Column has put out.
Okay, so we're going to begin with NATO. NATO tweeting this out today. Non-lethal weapons provide options to troops who are faced with uncertainty. And we've got a troop there with, well, it looks like a non-lethal weapon of some kind, but is it? In the responses to this tweet, Tim Fish said, at NATO, but if troops have to be given non-lethal weapons, does this mean they are no longer soldiers? They are policemen doing law and order. And well, this is an interesting question, but before we answer that question, let's look at this non-lethal weapon that this gent is carrying. This is it here. And in fact, when you go to the manufacturer's website, you discover that it's not a non-lethal weapon. It's a less lethal weapon. It's the FN Herstal FN 303. These are the munitions that it fires. It provides either a whole range of different things. They're all about the same size and shape. They go from impact only to including paint inside them, so that you can tag people with paint, but also something which is described as impact with an irritating effect. So inside the container is a paint dye which irritates the skin if it comes in contact with the skin. So that's pretty pleasant. Now, what they say, of course, on their description is that it can cause fatal injury, just like any sort of baton round delivery system, I suppose. On their website, they're saying law enforcement faces aggressive, violent, or hostile people, must be able to react with a proportional response. The use of lethal force is the last resort. Between the baton and firearms, less lethal systems are the immediate solution. For over a decade, they have been a leader in less lethal systems, such as the FN 303. It's designed around an impact projectile combined with a dedicated shoulder-fired or compact launcher. It's used by many security forces worldwide for temporary neutralization of suspects and maximum effectiveness and minimum risk, is what they say. They say it's very accurate and efficient, up to 50 meters, and it can be used to rapidly re-engage targets. Now, of course, the person commenting on the NATO tweet asked the question, are NATO becoming policemen? Are they going to serve a policing role? And I just want to bring back on screen the happy couple themselves, Jens Stoltenberg from NATO and Federica Mogherini, who's supposedly the foreign minister of the EU, at the European Defence Agency conference last November on the 17th. They were describing, or at least Mogherini was describing exactly this. She was absolutely certain that merging the police and policing functions and military functions should be high on the agenda. This was part and parcel of her keynote speech at that event. And she'd also, just by the way, had mentioned that EU treaties also have the necessary clause to enable an EU army, for example, and that those clauses could be invoked in the coming period. So this is what we're talking about here. It is something which has been on the policy agenda for quite some time, absolutely made public at the European Defence Agency conference last November, and now NATO are starting to tweet out about giving these types of munitions to. The other thing I should mention, of course, in our studio here on the wall is a target which is used for practicing with these types of weapons. It is the lower half of a human,
a male torso.
Male torso, yes. And when I was given that, I was told that the police in the UK were doing significant training over the last. I mean, that was over a year ago. I was told that, significant training with baton rounds, clearly expecting some kind of civil unrest. But this was what was being highlighted was that this training was over and above what they'd been doing in previous years, a sudden increase. So we're starting to see a picture here.
We are. Just to put part of that in context, Mike, of course, certainly the British military have carried out riot training over many years. Now, this has principally been done because they could be called into a situation of unrest, principally overseas, as part of their role. Disaster relief, Northern Ireland. So that part of the training has always taken place. What I think is significant about this is we are seeing a massive increase in all the talk about integration of the police and the military, the paramilitary police, and a lot of that training is being carried out at the Europol Police Training Academy. Part of that was, I think, until fairly recently in Kent. But also now we've got this statement from the EU saying this is the direction they want to go in. So I think there's a much bigger political picture coming here. And I think what they're really saying is there's going to be trouble in Europe, in Britain. How do they know that? They're going to create it.
David, we'll start with you. Have you got thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is, everyone needs to watch here what's going on. This is about internal and external blending of NATO, police, armed services, defence forces, or whatever they're going to be ultimately, into this stuff is going to be used on civilians. It's very straightforward, and they're gearing and training to go towards that. So everyone has got to wake up, and they've got to wake up fast.
And Alex, what are your thoughts?
The continent has a very different policing model, and I think that these less lethal rounds, we were given them the euphemistic name of plastic bullets and so on, but they're all kinds of rounds that don't necessarily have to be investigated if they're fired, basically. So you can fire them and accidentally kill or maim someone, and the investigation that has to be carried out is less. That kind of round is our equivalent of the Continental's water cannon, which you'll see shortly. The Belgians, for example, deploy willy-nilly. You just mentioned, David mentioned Northern Ireland crowd control. Well, you'll remember, Mike, that 20 years ago at Drumcree, when that got out of hand, there was talk about the RUC, as it still just then was, having to import a Belgian water cannon. But this was rejected out of hand then, because the RUC said, well, we've managed the worst civilian unrest in Europe for 30 years by that point without water cannon. But I think water cannons become politically unacceptable in Britain because of coverage of the German use of it in Stuttgart that blinded an old man. So instead, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And the other comment I would say in passing is we're definitely going to see a ratcheting up of, shall we say, party-based rhetoric on each side, or factional rhetoric that don't blame the security forces. It's necessary for them to take a harsh hand because of the protesters getting worse. And on the other hand, don't blame the protesters. There's so much US-style police violence coming into Europe. So you see ultimately the same financiers control both sides of the equation. And we're stuck there in the middle.
Well, Alex, something you wanted us to highlight was a message from a UK column viewer. This is something that you're still looking into, but it is a question that's worth raising in this context. And the UK column viewer said, for information, the Dutch police have just a couple of weeks ago been issued with new uniform insignia. It is now exactly the same as the German police uniform insignia. And they say, whereas before the Dutch insignia included the Royal Dutch Crown, this no longer exists. It has been removed. No notification was given, just in order to get the new badges and fit them on uniforms. All ranks, etc., are identical in both countries. The implications are obvious.
And you would expect that of all the neighbours of Germany, the Dutch, with their atrocious experiences in the Nazi occupation, would be the very last to integrate the police. But they have been the first to integrate the majority of the real punching parts of their army. About 2/3 of their mechanised infantry are now under German command. And as I said before, a lad in my church is very happy to serve as an officer in that setup and doesn't see anything wrong with it. It's very blind, really, the Dutch approach. And I take this information seriously from this view. I'm looking into it. I suspect it relates in the first instance to parade insignia, because the Dutch police, their street uniform, as they call it, has already in 2014 been changed from the old-fashioned shirt and trousers to a kind of lycra black image with a bit of fluorescent strip on it, as it has in Britain, but even worse, really. under the excuse of efficiency. So I suspect that we'll see them on the parade ground first of all, resembling each other and having a no crown uniform, Europol basically, integrated Euro gendarmerie. We're allegedly not in that, but you covered just the other day that we have opted back in. We seem to do a tango here. We've opted back into what we previously opted out of, the European policing pillar, which came in with the Treaty of Amsterdam. It's quite possible that once we've got back into it, we can never get out again. And as we've seen before with these overlapping diagrams, it can be the case that even when you leave the EU, as with the military stuff, so with the policing stuff, there are still cooperation forums which are hard to get out of, which have nothing to do with the EU. So watch carefully.
Indeed, and so this is what's going on in Belgium at the moment. Belgian trade unions in a violent standoff. These are military trade unions. Give us the background.
There are, as with everything in Belgium, it's doubled. There's 2 times 2 military trade unions. I don't know what the 2 functions are, but each of them exist for the French and the Dutch-speaking half of the country. And the real problem seems to have been the French-speaking Wallonia military union. And one of these groups appears to have got, I've looked into it in Belgian media. I was actually in Brussels till yesterday morning. I left an hour before it all kicked off, fortunately. I didn't know about it. But it seems that one of these union guys, or one of the union factions, got their men bevied up, and you can see them put hoodies on across their face, and you can't see them throwing any projectiles at the Belgian police, but they do what they always do, even when it's civilian protesters, which is roll up with 2 great water cannon trucks and say, disperse now or you get fired on. And as I mentioned with that elderly gentleman in Stuttgart, if you get that full in your face, it can penetrate the vitreous humour and you lose the eye straight away. It's pretty ghastly. But
Alex, you were mentioning water cannon in Northern Ireland a minute ago. I think it was about 30 years ago now. There was a well-known Northern Irish local presenter on television offered or volunteered to be hit by water cannon just to demonstrate what the effect of it was, and he basically said he felt like he was drowning. He was pretty unwell for quite some time after he was hit directly by that. So it is a pretty unpleasant thing.
Well, it's just as with waterboarding, and I was in GCHQ. One of my sidelines, as it were, was the chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threat. So I actually went and got gassed with CS gas and all this as a test. And one of the things I know about water cannon and waterboarding is that it's deliberately intended not just to be a jet to hit the guy you're aiming at, but also to make all the guys around them feel that they're drowning because of the intensity of water vapor that they're inhaling at the time. But I say between that and perhaps the British softer approach or less direct approach of these non-lethal bullets that happen to kill a lot of people anyway, we're going to end up with a lot of fear. And the one thing I'd say about that Belgian military trade union, apart from sending their men out drunk and masked, which is pretty nasty, and the obvious civil implications of having the military against the police in the capital of Europe. One of the things that's worrying about this is that the Belgian press asked one of their police sources, how would you rate this for violence? And he said, I'd give it a 7 out of 10. And for Belgium, where there's violent protests every week, more or less, that implies that there's some serious Sorosite types have infiltrated the French-speaking parts of the Belgian army.
Well, you wanted me to just play a little section of the video clip from it. Just tell us what it was you wanted to highlight.
Focus on the police. I have sympathy with the police in this situation. Just look at the number of these guys. They're clearly military men, as you can see. But look at the number who have got stockings on and hoodies. And as the police move apart from each other, you can see there's some defiant behaviour going on. I haven't got footage of it, but the press described how firecrackers were thrown under those police lines to catch the policeman's feet. So there was a lot of stuff, as you see here, a lot of debris being chucked. So obviously the beginning of the video you're now playing shows the heavy-handed police turning up, as it would appear. So we get sympathy with the protesters. But if you look at towards the end here, this is my point from a moment ago. Don't believe either side in this rhetoric of police violence versus nasty protesters or heroic protesters standing up against police violence. Both of these sides are compromised. And if you follow the money, you will get back to the same people.
Okay.
Yeah. I think we'd just add to that, of course, that the taser that came in as a sort of non-violent weapon, and the deaths are in the hundreds now of that, and its safety record was supposedly proven by a doctor from Birmingham Heartlands Hospital who said it's safe except if you get hit in the eye or the groin or the neck or X, Y, and Z. So I'm quite sure these other weapons are going to be exactly the same, dangerous. Well, we're now at a pitiful state because a Telegraph article is saying that the Royal Navy is to be without anti-ship missiles, that the Harpoon missile system is going to be withdrawn in 2018, leaving the Royal Navy simply with guns. Now, that is a very simple statement. What it actually means is ships totally unable to defend themselves or to project the power they're supposed to. And apparently these missiles are unlikely to be replaced for a decade. But helicopter-launched anti-surface ship missiles are also going to suffer a 2-year gap. So if we summarize this, we've got no working aircraft carriers. We haven't got the F-35s at sea. We've got no maritime patrol aircraft. We've got warships that don't work in warm water. We've now got warships that are going to have no proper capability.
And aircraft carriers that have nowhere to berth, apparently.
Aircraft carriers have trouble berthing. They're having to scrape out millions of cubic yards of seabed to get them into Portsmouth. We'll come on to that a little bit. So extraordinary events going on here. This is the Telegraph reporter who produced this story, Ben Farmer. I'd just like to point out on his Twitter account, he mentions this incredible situation that basically we're going to have a Royal Navy that simply does not function. He gives it one line, but at the same time, this man bigs up the Russian threat, but there's no proper common sense analysis from him. So the fact that the Royal Navy is not going to function, that's a one-line tweet, and you just carry on with your daily life. Well, before we hand over to Alex and David on this one, just let me follow through this comment from some key people. We got former Rear Admiral Chris Parry. He says it's a significant capability gap and the government is being irresponsible. It just shows that our warships are for the shop window and not for fighting. This is newspeak as far as I can see, because what he's really describing is the fact that we cannot defend ourselves. That's treason. We've got Lord West of Spithead. He's in his proper uniform here. He's also appeared as a pirate. Check that for yourself. He says this is just another example of where the lack of money is squeezing and making the nation less safe. So he seems to think that money makes decisions when, of course, we know it's the politicians making the decisions. But in Portsmouth, same logic here. He says that Russians' military spending was sort of unstoppable, and he's warning about nuclear weapons and the military. It's a little bit worrying. And here's the main man, Mr. Fallon, on his visit to Portsmouth. He was getting very excited because we got the QE class aircraft carriers coming in, apparently. Well, not yet. They've got to dredge the harbour to get them in. This is costing 100 million plus other things. But these are not going to be operational at sea for many years. But he was getting very excited that there's been a £13.5 million contract for 60 rubber boats. So I think this sums it up. David, I'm going to pass it over to you. We are seeing the Royal Navy decimated, presumably to ensure that we're locked into the EU military system, but we're seeing just bizarre language from politicians and former senior military people. They do not seem to be in their right, they don't seem to have their right senses about them.
They're absolutely not using the right language. What we've got here is the Royal Navy is finished. It's finished. It is unable to put to sea in anger. So therefore it's finished. It's not a question of decimating it. That's 1 in 10. They have obliterated it. To an extent, the money, yes, but the decision making and the policy, obviously, which is key. And we spoke about this on many times about following that and following the trail. So they've choked the money off and they've killed it. It's now dead. So what we're going to end up with is a change agenda here at some stage, because it'll have to change into something else. So my question is, well, they don't clearly. Mr. Fallon doesn't want a Royal Navy, does he? And nor does he want Her Majesty's Armed Services. So he's clearly marching. The path, if it's not apparent to anyone by now what this man is doing and what the government is doing, it is not Putin that is causing the problems. It is not Putin that is doing the damage. He isn't doing the cutting. He isn't rendering the armed services completely and utterly moribund. It is our own government that are undertaking this. No one else, just them, and the tiny control group that runs them. So, the question is for everyone here is if you wish to see the armed services retained, now is the time that you're going to have to stand up and start saying the right things. So we've gone far enough now. We can see the game. They're now taking the missiles off the ships. That's it. The Royal Navy no longer exists.
Yeah. Well, David, I couldn't agree more. And there is no question there is no Brexit. There's something much darker going on. I think you're going to take us through some of that, Mike.
So a couple of days ago was the EU Foreign Affairs Council. Well, we didn't cover it because we knew David Ellis would be on today. Well, Boris Johnson before the meeting was describing how they had a very full agenda. They're going to be focusing on Yemen, Lebanon, and Turkey. But he also said we'll talk about the common foreign security policy, the common security and defence policy that's been developed, and measures to take forward European defence cooperation, where I think we've made some good progress. The UK is supportive, he said. The UK is supportive, and I look forward to the conversations. He said, I think the crucial thing about European efforts on defence is that it's a good thing if everyone steps up to the plate and spends a bit more on defence themselves. One of the great things about our government is that we do spend 2% of GDP on defence. We're heavily committed. We're out there in all the key EU operations, Operation Sophia, Operation Atalanta, and UK is a major player. I personally think it's a good thing if other European countries do shoulder more of their responsibilities and spend a bit more on defence. I wouldn't be against that. It's important when you're setting up these EU structures that they should be complementary with NATO. You shouldn't undermine the fundamental security architecture that's looked after us for the last 70 years. So he is absolutely saying that what they're setting up is EU structures. He's saying that the UK is supportive of this, and he's extremely keen to see it progress. Well, that kind of flies in the face of the Express this morning, saying Britain kills off plans for EU army after a string of countries back the UK. But when you actually read down through the article, it is one particular aspect of it that EU countries were supporting the UK on, and it was this one, where Fallon was saying that instead of spending or planning expensive new headquarters or dreaming of an EU army, what Europe needs to do now is spend more on its own defence. That is the best possible approach to the Trump presidency. Britain needs the 2% commitment. Other European countries need to increase their own defence spending. So he's really only pushing back on the spending issue and the fact that EU countries aren't carrying their fair share, according to the British. Look, at the end of the day, if you look at what Federica Mogherini was saying following this meeting, talking about European defence cooperation, EU military, she was saying this is a qualitative leap, and we're going to start implementing as of tomorrow, that's today. Our plan is ambitious, concrete and pragmatic. And in the press release that they gave, they said that they adopted conclusions on various things, including EU global strategy on foreign and security policy. And she said absolutely that EU defence policy was part of a larger shared vision, common action, a stronger Europe, part of this global strategy on foreign and security policy. So it is absolutely clear. And as I said in the earlier slide, anytime you see Jens Stoltenberg and Federica Mogherini together, they're hugging and kissing on camera. They absolutely love each other. There is no question that these plans are being developed absolutely side by side with NATO. Well, she went on, I think I've mentioned this, it's a plan for European security and defence. It is an integral part of a package that is much broader than that. NATO is absolutely involved, and any suggestion by Michael Fallon that this is somehow usurping NATO's position is completely disingenuous. David, what are your thoughts?
Well, you've got Fallon and Boris there absolutely working as hard as they possibly can in order to get full EU military union, defence union. So they're absolutely clear. Their policy is one of the key thing. The policy is clearly derived about propping up the euro currency, because now what they're talking about is spending. So that's the key thing for everybody to consider and work from. So they're going to be spending money. They're going to be spending euros. Who are they going to be spending that money with on all this equipment and stuff? So there's not many options. There's not many places that you can go shopping. So all of that money is going to rush suddenly and into all the big US conglomerates, Boeing, Lockheed, all the rest of them. And what are we going to see? We're going to see that money stick at some stage in one of those companies. It's going to pool, and one of them is going to cling on to that little bit of money flow, and they're going to then buy BAE. That's what's going to happen. And we're not going to have our own defense because we're going to be locked into EU, and we're not going to have our own defense capability to actually produce anything. Yeah. So this is going to be the outcomes. And you've got these two politicians here absolutely flat to the stop making it happen.
Yes. Okay, well, let's move on then. And well, we mentioned Theresa May's Mansion House speech yesterday. I just wanted to remind everybody of the quote at the end of this. She said, "Time and again, it is British leadership, British hard and soft power that is the forefront of how the world responds to the greatest challenges of our time." And Alex, I'm going to ask you, I know I'm sort of dropping this on you, but I'm going to ask you for a comment on this in a second. But the BBC has announced that the World Service is being expanded, the biggest expansion since the 1940s, apparently. 11 new language services as part of its biggest expansion. I'm not going to list them all, but they're saying that as well as the 11 new language services, which are going to launch in 2017, they're going to provide extended news bulletins in Russian with regionalized versions for surrounding countries, enhanced television services across Africa, including more than 30 new TV programs for partner broadcasters across sub-Saharan Africa, new regional programming from BBC Arabic, shortwave and medium wave radio programs aimed at audiences in the Korean Peninsula, as well as online and social media content, and investment in World Service English with new programs, more original journalism, they say, and a broader agenda. Let's get the quote. The quote is from Fran Unsworth, and she says, "As an independent broadcaster," sorry, I should warn everybody, this might make you laugh slightly. "As an independent broadcaster," she says, "we remain as relevant as ever in the 21st century, when in many places there is not more free expression, but less. Today's announcement is about transforming the world service by investing for the future. We must follow our audience who consume the news in changing ways. An increasing number of people are watching the world service on TV, and many services are now digital only. We will be able to speed up our digital transformation, especially for younger audiences. What will not change is our commitment to independent, impartial journalism." So, Alex, what are your thoughts on this?
In the first instance, David, I'm wondering where the money is going to come from, because BBC World already had a massive commercial expansion a few years ago. And at that stage, it started the shift from radio to TV and increasingly to internet. But as far as I can see, its viewer and listenership has been dropping like a stone. They did try to dress it up in various ways. But at least the journalist was accurate there in saying that they're a separate commercial entity. At least separate on paper from the rest of the BBC. And yes, like BBC Monitoring and BBC Media Action, they have these independent fronts, but they're all part of the BBC brand. I was particularly struck there by mention of the short and medium wave to, well, they don't say to North Korea, although it's clearly what they mean. They say to the Korean Peninsula, because Korean radios are still, according to the latest information I've seen, sold pre-tuned to government stations in that hideous despotism. So I'm not quite sure how they're intending to get the message across. And this makes me wonder that perhaps all of this is a bit like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which was the US Congress and State Department funded equivalent. That actually, I think what they're doing is pretending to be a heroic front of alternative and accurate information to these oppressed peoples of Eastern Europe and Korea and whatnot, and that funds their junket. whereas in fact they're not particularly reaching many people, and I don't think that concerns them as long as they're serving their paymasters and churning the stuff out. So the tone of the World Service anyway has changed. When I was a student, I listened to the shortwave radio version, and you remember the old voices. This news comes to you in the World Service of the BBC, with the excellent diction and so on. And by the 2000s, that decade, it was all about women's lib and microcredit and all kinds of fashionable ideas. And I shudder to think what it's about now. I wouldn't even bother to tune in. I think basically it's just an operation in churning over to look busy. And all these Russian peripheral countries that are going to get new BBC World Service TV, they're absolutely not going to watch that stuff. They have plenty of stuff of their own to watch in those countries.
Well, it's interesting that on the media show, which I hear from time to time, was discussing the new terms of the charter for the BBC, and the World Service was being described as the only remaining section of the BBC that still receives Foreign Office money. It's interesting that you ask that question. Where is this money coming from? I suspect that's where it is coming from.
Yes, FCO, the latter years that I was there, was increasingly having meetings with stakeholders, as they call them, and partners saying, what are we going to fund, which parts of the BBC? And I was in one of the meetings where BBC Monitoring, in that case, dropped it upon us. We're going to cut your service, sadly, because, we're not receiving BBC funding anymore. And at that point, FCO and the various agencies of government said, we're so desperate for this stuff that we will pay for it ourselves. So there has been a takeover. If the French or Americans were funding things so directly, or even the Germans, we would be pointing, and particularly the Russians would be pointing and saying, this is too definitely government funded. But we seem to be able to get away with it. Perhaps it's because of the legendary clout of our soft power that everything that's British is branded good, and so we can just kid ourselves it's fine and impartial to do that.
Yes.
Kid ourselves being the right word. Well, thanks to a little bit of research from one of our viewers yesterday, we'd just like to return very, very briefly to BBC reporter Mr. Sillitoe. Now, this was the gentleman that produced this astonishing article on Trump. And in it, he said that Trump's success, well, this was a quote from Professor Jeff Jarvis, but it comes in under the pen of Mr. Sillitoe. He said that Trump's success is a sign that the media failed to communicate the truth with enough force. And we said, well, this is completely delusional because there was no truth coming out of particularly the BBC. But our sharp-eyed viewer found that Mr. Sillitoe had actually had himself reframed. He'd been through a mindfulness course, which resulted in a whole article and video by the BBC. You can find it on Mrs. Mindfulness's website has got it, so you can go there to find this video. I think you should listen to it. Basically, his colleague said it's amazing what only 8 weeks of mindfulness practice did for David. Measurable effects in his brain. His work colleague saying he's a changed man, live on air, and his own noticing that he's calmer and better able to handle challenges. So he's clearly been reframed. This is one of the experts, supposedly, who's doing the work. We can be pretty certain that after 6 large-scale random, I believe he says nice. It's a little bit difficult to make out, but I think they're nice trials. The mindfulness training of the sort, very similar to the program we did, will more than halve the cases of relapsing depression. That's a statistic which I would absolutely challenge. And here's the comment from Mr. Sillitoe. He said, I used to have an aversion to beards, sandals, and Eastern mysticism. It wasn't my cup of tea, but when I was told these people were working with US Marines, and you talk to neuroscientists, they're interested in what's going on here. The inference is it's all okay. So there we are, heavily reframed BBC man who thinks the BBC tells the truth. And we'd like to just pop this up. This was also given to us this morning. Apparently in Radio 4, so that is today, a great lie during a discussion on the RSPCA in which they said all other charities and individuals gave up the right to prosecute when the Crown Prosecution Service came into being. So a complete distortion as to the way our law works. Drifted in as the BBC so neatly does with Radio 4.
I certainly didn't give up that right. Did you give up that right?
I didn't know. And of
No.
course, the key bit is there is not the comment on the charities, it's the individual giving up the right to progress criminal prosecution. So it's either incompetence by the BBC, we don't think so, it's part of a lie. Well, a few just quick adverts here. Tonight we've got UK Column's very own briefing at the George Hotel, Plimpton at 7:30. And we're delighted to say that Vanessa Beeley is going to be giving us a presentation on events in Syria. We've still got a lot of movement for the British Constitution Group conference on Saturday. This is going to be an incredible event. Ticket sales are now over 300 and we've still got more coming in. So if you want to get to this event, you need to get online and get your tickets booked, although there should be some still available on the day. And I'll just hold this on screen briefly. This is a sneak preview at the programme for the day. And of course, we've got our very own speakers, David Ellis and Alex Thompson, who are with us for the news today. They'll also be speaking, plus Vanessa Beeley, plus John Bingley, highly respected constitutional expert, and many other people talking about the fact we now live in a lawless state. There's the afternoon session. And as I say, if you haven't got a ticket, you really need to get online and get one booked. Now, before we just return to the news, we'd also like to say that we've been very, very sad to hear that common law campaigner Patrick Cullinan has died. Patrick, who 66 years has been a really outstanding campaigner against injustice in the courts, was found dead at home. Absolutely tragic. So our thoughts go out to family, but we wanted to give recognition to a man who has simply said, no, I'm not going to lie down and ignore the courts and the injustice in UK. I'm going to put my head above the parapet and fight.
Okay, Alex, you wanted to mention the state of Britain's prisons. Now, of course, there was what appeared to be industrial action by prison officers, and prison officers aren't supposed to be taking industrial action. They tried to approach it from a slightly different angle. The government went to court yesterday and got an injunction, so they had to return to work. Prisoners apparently being locked, doors weren't being unlocked yesterday because of staff shortages as a result of that. And we seem to be having riots going on, certainly in one prison. So what else can you tell us?
There's been a wave of this stuff. I'm personally interested because I grew up just a few miles outside Bedford and went to school there, and the jail is a town centre one, quite famous because it's, of course, it was the town where John Howard was sheriff in the 18th century, and who became a great prison reformer. So that's why Bedford Prison is still of international interest. It's one of the last of the old style real local county, well, in American parlance, county jails, local prisons, and it's woefully crowded and has nowhere to expand because it's in a town centre. It also takes all the, shall we say, the fallout from Luton increasingly turning into a riot zone. So that's why it's in a particular interest. You've got this fake Islamization going on with very questionable imams who have interesting links to certain organizations suddenly turning up, and half the prison apparently having gone Muslim, and then when you look into it, they've never read a Quran and they've just basically joined a gang calling itself Muslim. That's the background to this. But Bedford has particular challenges because it is so decrepit. And there's nothing for the inmates to do. They're supposedly only there on remand, but they often end up being held there longer, and the facilities are not there for them to do anything sensible. So they go doolally. That's really what's going on. And you have
and of course, you've got the added problem of the fact that smoking has been banned.
Yes, I mean, these guys, you can understand what banning, illegal drugs, although it does seem a lot of men actually get hooked while they're in prison. And obviously drugs being used as a currency by some corrupt screws, but also by prisoners among themselves. But no, if you give people no outlet whatsoever and say, oh, no, gym is old-fashioned, it's too macho for prison these days, or there's no space for gym, no time for gym, and then you say there's no smoking allowed, it's, people are obviously going to go stir crazy.
Yeah. Now, Alex, we're short for time, but you wanted to highlight this book, The Role of Prison in Europe, and I believe you had some hand in translating this.
Yes, I was a translator for this. The author is Professor Tom van der Beken at Ghent University. He's one of Europe's leading professors of criminology and penal law. And he visited Bedford for one of the chapters of his books comparing prisons across Europe. And he visited in 2014. And if you freeze the frame afterwards, you can read what he says there, which is really the introduction to Bedford Jail section of his book, where he says, how did I get in so easily? Is this really a category B jail? So that's the first indication stuff has gone wrong. And then I will very quickly summarize what he says once he was inside Bedford. He says, undoubtedly, this is not on screen, this is another part now. Undoubtedly, the most striking discovery I make here at Bedford is the strong emphasis on categorizing and classifying inmates. Each of the several categories has its own regulations and wings. For me, the system of incentives and earned privileges is telling in what it reveals about how prisoners are viewed in today's Britain. And he goes on to say that you don't automatically have the so-called right to things like visits or cash in prison. You can rise or fall in the rankings as a result of how you're perceived to be accepting your sentence or not for actually duffing up a fellow prisoner, but for saying the wrong thing. You can, and you start on the basic level, not on the standard level. You see, you have to work your way up to standard privileges. I don't think people are aware of this stuff, how nasty and dangerous our prisons are. More time outside the cell only comes if you get 2 levels up to enhanced privileges, and you only do that by volunteering your labour for free 7 days a week, which is against British and European legislation, as he points out. British inmates are not all of equal status. And when he complains about this to, it's a friend of his who is a Cambridge college master who is the chair of the independent visiting board for the prison, the British host writes back and says, "Dear Tom, you're right. We have muddled thinking about whether prisoners are people in Britain and what prisons are for." He then finally says that there's no outdoor space to exercise, and this goes. It's nothing more than a holding centre. This goes some way to explain the impression I have that prisoners in Bedford are just being given something to do to keep them from having idle hands. There is no purposeful activity, or very limited. They're at a loose end. And then he finally says what a shock he had when he found that Bedfordshire Police had an intelligence unit inside the prison. And he says, while Bedfordshire Police clearly are interested in building up a profile of people at HMP Bedford, the same cannot be said of the parole board. According to my host, it's been 4 years since they last showed up there.
Yeah, dangerous stuff. So a lot of what's the word? Pressure building up in prisons. But we've seen Common Purpose going in to train prisoners in leadership. We got Virgin Trains taking ex-prisoners as part of their staff. But we've also got reform of prisons coming up in UK. I think we can guess where it's going. Well, Alex, I'll just put this one in very briefly. A lot of people contacted us this morning to say that a French TV documentary had spoken out on the stealing of children in Britain. That's a little insert of their webpage. You did a little bit of transcript of what was being talked about. But this gentleman who's on screen is saying that child theft is the #1 business in Britain. And without any pretext, judges do exactly what the local authorities ask them to do. Nobody ever gets their children back from British social services. What they do is indefensible. The only way you can ever get them back is track them down and take them. I have not seen this documentary, but just to give our viewers and listeners a pointer, what did you think of what you saw?
Well, I only heard the audio, Brian. I think what they do is it's a French public broadcaster, France Culture, and they issue the audio with a write-up on the website before they show the video live on the TV, and then the video gets released. But the audio is perfectly convincing. This is a professional, calm Frenchman whose mother of the children abandoned him and the girls years ago. And so he moved to Brighton, had a good job there. They were very settled. But he was targeted because Brighton is, I'm going to be honest about it. There's a lot of homosexual couples in Brighton and Hove. They can't have children of their own, and they want children, basically. And the easiest thing to do is to target a foreigner, especially a single father or mother. So stuff was invented about him. He very calmly explained it to the French journalists. The children didn't arrive home one day from school. He inquired and found that they hadn't even got on the bus. Before he knew it, visit from the police. And then when he looked into that, he had documents forged by Brighton and Hove Social Services because it's still a legal requirement in all British jurisdictions that you give up your children, that you consent, which is why UK Column and others always say, do not sign anything put in front of you about your children. But they got around that, as in many, many other cases, by simply forging the documents. Judge wasn't interested in hearing the story. And the fact that this is now going out on French highbrow TV and radio and internet is quite something. Central European broadcasters have been saying this for a long time, Eastern European diplomats, but for the French public to hear about it is quite a step up.
It's deeply sinister, this, and as we said at the start of the news, we can now see the picture really coming to the surface. Britain is turning into a dictatorship. This is obviously planned, and it requires exposure, rapid exposure by a very large number of people to stop it.
But in the meantime, the child sexual abuse inquiry continues bumbling through its crisis. Another lawyer has quit. According to the Telegraph here, this is Eileen McColgan. She was particularly looking at the activities of the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church, but she said that it's time for her to go because she doesn't like the way the thing is being run. But the other thing I wanted to highlight, just remember yesterday, the day before, we were talking about this report heading back to harm on missing children being trafficked. Unaccompanied asylum-seeking children going missing from UK care at an alarmingly high rate. Well, today, naturally, a day or two after that report came out, The Guardian is pushing this article, "Jack's childhood is slipping away. Social workers must advocate for child refugees." So we must have a new source of children. And this is by Polly Baines. This is part of the Social Care Network. The Social Life blog, according to The Guardian, is written by people who work in or use social care services. If you'd like to write an article for the series, you can, if you're in that business. And this article says, "Last week I met a 6-year-old boy who I will call Jack. Jack was exposed to violence as a young child and his father is no longer involved in his life." Go on to say that Jack displays obvious signs of trauma. He sleeps poorly because he has nightmares. And during her visit, Jack was desperate for her attention. He wanted to hold her hand and stroke her face. And she said that children's social workers often meet boys like Jack. We get back into our cars, remembering the feel of their hand in ours, worrying, considering involving the local children's centre, calling a family group conference, contacting the school, convening a child protection meeting. But she could do none of these things for Jack because he was a child refugee living in a camp in Greek island. And she said that Amber Rudd's inbox needs to be full of letters from social workers asking her to speed up the asylum process, accept more children and families, and support them properly when they get here. Unfortunately, that's not what happens. They do not get the support when they come here. What they end up is being stolen, as Alex has been talking about, into the care system. And as we have been continually pointing out, of course, once they end up in the care system, they don't necessarily stay there. They quite often disappear out the other side into being trafficked within the UK. And until social workers, until the social care, the child care system, MPs, the charities, and the people pushing for more children to come into this country on this basis are prepared to finally answer this question of what are they going to do to protect these children, we have a major problem which needs to be dealt with.
This could only happen, Mike, with the total collaboration of the highest levels of government. So when we analyse this, where does it take us to the fact that the elements of the British government, the establishment, the top levels of the civil service, judiciary, police are all involved in the trafficking and abuse of children? This could not happen without collaboration on that scale.
Right. Alex, I'm going to get David's comments on this one as well. Alex, we've been talking about the Purple Revolution in the United States over the last few days. You wanted to highlight this from Portland Police Bureau. 71 people arrested in Saturday night protest in downtown Portland. This is obviously a protest against Donald Trump. And you wanted me particularly to highlight that image. That says it all, really, doesn't it?
Yes, the sheriff's office for the county, which contains Portland, which is the state capital of Oregon, claimed that these photos were in no particular order, and they just grouped them up into batches of 9 and put each batch of 9 in a JPEG. But JPEG number 1 is clearly put together by a public-spirited person in the sheriff's department in Portland in order to say, look, this is what we're dealing with, because the rest of them are less outrageous. But look at these guys. Just look at them for a moment. Right, these are the guys who are being picked up and there are others who are just having tantrums around the streets. There's been a child whose father has died because a 4-year-old child, because the man was being rushed to hospital, and this rabble was out in the streets, paid for by Soros through bunches through sites like Craigslist, and they were blocking the streets, and the access roads to the hospital for 3/4 of an hour. So people are dying because of this, all for some purple color revolution. So those mugshots do say a lot, really. And I don't think you had any other slide on that, but it was important to add that a local journalistic or a local radio station in Portland looked into the publicly available records, as they are in the US, of who voted, not, of course, how.
Oh, right. That's this one. Yes.
Good. Now, of the 100 and whatnot people arrested in one evening, the journalists did some good old-fashioned investigation and tallied them up, and they found that 35 were not registered to vote. Another 35 applied for a postal ballot, because Oregon is the first state some years ago now that's gone completely over to postal voting. So that was the only way to vote, and they didn't return it, or it didn't arrive. Another 25 did vote, and the remaining 17, I believe it was, were outstanding cases to be investigated. So these are not Democrat voters. And bear in mind what I said last week, about the narrow coastal strips containing these 60 million alleged Hillary voters with a lot of massaging going on. These were not even in that lot. They're just, rent-a-mob, quite literally. And this is exactly what Soros has done back from the first colour revolution in Georgia in 2003, which I have to say, one of the two HMG experts in. And we didn't see it coming because we didn't see which channels it was being funded from. It was not native to the politics of that country. It was funded through alternative financial means, and it just didn't even get malcontents and misfits. It went for people who were prepared to riot for money. And that's exactly what's going to happen to this one as well. But as with that whole swathe of colour revolutions, the successful ones like Ukraine that lasted for a year before going wrong, also the ones that never happened like Azerbaijan and Egypt, they'll all go belly up because there's no quality in the people who are being paid to riot.
Yeah. David, have you any thoughts on this?
Yeah, totally agree with Alex. Rent-a-mob and a temporary, it's a temporary disruption, attempting to get a delay. We said it's not sustainable, but clearly, we've got the potential for seeing it here in the UK, with us wanting to try and get our Parliament back. So let's look out.
Yes. Okay. And Alex, we'll just end briefly on this one if we can, because this is a fascinating story from Russia yesterday, that the Russian economic development minister arrested for taking what appears to be a $2 million bung.
Yes, the former Soviet countries have a separate post from the finance ministry, which they call the Ministry of Economic Development. And these are the guys who look at monopolies and mergers and license to operate and those kinds of things. So basically, they're the ones to nobble if you're a Western company wanting a monopoly of a Eurasian country's hydrocarbons or extractive industries. And the economic development ministers have been an Achilles heel in all of the Eurasian countries. The central banks of the West are very, very keen for their men to be involved. The best Russian blogger of all, Saker, Saker, if you look at his blog, in a page called Putin's Biggest Failure, has named Ulyukayev as one of his 9 top fifth columnists in the Russian system. Putin doesn't have an inherent understanding of the economy, but he does understand that, as Saker himself puts it, the blogger, if Putin were immediately to remove all the fifth columnists who want Euro integration of Russia, the West would do something even worse than what it did over Crimea. So that's probably something that David will want a quick word on as well, the way in which international and Western bankers control countries like Russia through the post of economic development minister.
David?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's all about the money and the variance of who controls the money. So that's the key thing for everyone to remember. It's not. I mean, the analogy I've used. It's not the 645 MPs in Parliament or whatever it is. It's the tiny control group above them that control the money. All we need to do is just to get those guys to wake up and do their job. It's a difficult task, obviously, but Putin's got exactly the same issues. They're not as ingressed there in Russia as far as they are here or in the US. So that's predominantly why they always want to have a bit of Russia bashing, and of course it does suit them to an extent because they can argue for this European military union to come about in order that they can continue to precipitate with their currency.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of today's news. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. what a package, really. It's becoming ever more clear that Britain, unless we stop it, is being taken into big society, that is a fascistic society, which David Cameron talked about. Theresa May is doing it. And of course, the EU supranational state is a key part of that big society. Can we stop it? Yes, but it's up to us. We have to act. That's it for today. We'll be back tomorrow, and we'll be joined by David Scott from Northern Exposure. Thank you. Bye-bye.